Kia ora, everybody, and welcome to our closeout session for Dyslexia Awareness Month, where we are joined by the esteemed Dr. Tiffany Hogan. I want to introduce today's webinar and session where we are focusing on dyslexia and developmental language disorder, the similarities and differences for improved literacy outcomes. So Tiffany, before I carry on with my sort of formal introduction of you, I'm going to ask you or hand over to you to just share your slide deck and get that all working. Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much to everybody who is joining us this afternoon from New Zealand and potentially further afield. It is my great pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Tiffany Hogan. We are absolutely thrilled to have her particularly joining us to present this webinar. Dr. Tiffany Hogan is a professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the MGH Institute of Health Professions and a research associate at none other than the Harvard Medical School. Tiffany's research focuses on the connections between oral and written language, particularly how we can better assess and support children with dyslexia and developmental language disorder in our schools. She's also the founder of DLD and Me, the host of the See, Hear, Speak podcast, and an advisor for Reading Universe. Tiffany is deeply passionate about ensuring that every child receives evidence-based instruction and that neurodiversity is recognised and celebrated. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tiffany Hogan to present this webinar to us today. Thanks so much, Tiffany, and I'm going to hand over to you to take us through this content. I will just very quickly share that I know you have a really jam-packed session for us in a bid to try to really support people in building their knowledge and their practice in this space. We may not have time for questions at the end. If we do, Bethany, my colleague, will step in and facilitate those. She will also be monitoring the chat throughout the course of this webinar. But before coming into the webinar, Dr. Tiffany Hogan suggested that she would really love it if people could lean into the content that's being shared, take notes where you can, and engage with the content. And if there are any really pressing questions afterwards, please feel free to email those through to me and I'll make sure that those questions are addressed in some way, shape or form. Over to you, Tiffany.
Thank you so much for having me, Carla. I very much appreciate it. I will get us started. First, I just want to give a few acknowledgements. I'm going to be sharing with you a plethora of research around dyslexia and developmental language disorder. And this is not research that only I've done, but it's been done for many decades. So I'm truly standing on the shoulders of giants sharing this work with you. I want to thank my lab because I'm one person sharing this work, but it represents a team approach. And in particular, I want to thank my school partners. Everything I've truly learned from my school partners. This is us in the lab. My lab is mainly in schools, but I do have a space and we often are looking at data and discussing data. I want to thank the parents and children that have entrusted their data and stories with me to share today. And I also want to thank Carla and Learning Matters for this amazing opportunity. And last but not least, I want to thank you for taking time out of your precious day to learn something new. This quote drives me, and I hope it inspires you as well. A ship is safe in harbor, but that's not what ships are for. And you got out of your safe harbor to learn something new today. So thank you so much for joining me. So I'll start out. You don't often see a webinar starting out with The Simpsons, but I think it really hits home a point. And that is, what is reading? When you're thinking about reading, what is it? Often when we're discussing reading and reading acquisition and reading struggles, we may not be thinking about the same skill when we're talking to different people. So in this example, I don't want you to think who is reading. So Bart is in trouble per usual. He's had some mischievous times, and so he has been sent to his grandfather's every day after school. and he is to read to his grandfather. So he's reading aloud to his grandfather. His grandfather has cataracts, so he's not able to read the text very well, but he's listening to the language that's produced by Bart as he reads printed words. So in this example, there's a key caveat, and that is that Bart is reading German and he doesn't speak German. So he's learning how to decode German. He can read it okay, but he really doesn't understand a lot of the language. So he's reading, but he's not really understanding the language created by the text. But grandfather understands German, and oftentimes he'll chuckle understanding a joke that was read aloud to him and such. So in this case, who do you think is really reading? Is it Bart because he's turning the printed words into something spoken? Or is it grandfather because he's understanding the language that was created by that spoken text? So take a minute and think about it. Who do you think is reading? Well, I'll have to say I'm tricking you because I would argue that neither one is reading, because what we know is that reading is focused on the ultimate goal of comprehension. So when I think of reading, I'm thinking of reading comprehension, and that is the ability to read words and understand. So I would argue that neither is reading because you need both of these skills. But it's important to keep this in mind because as I present to different audiences and different professionals, some of them think that Bart's the one that's reading, even if he doesn't understand it. Some think that Grandpa's the one that's reading because he's understanding the passage, but you really need both of these. And this has been formulated into an oft used framework called the simple view of reading. This captures the complexity of reading comprehension. And over 1,000 citations in many languages show that if you want to understand how well a child can comprehend the text that they read, you have to know two pieces of information. You have to know how accurate and fluent they can read single words, and you have to know how well they can understand oral language that they're hearing. If you understand those two pieces of information, you can predict how well a child will be able to comprehend text. Now, this is the simple view, but it's quite complex, and the complexity lies in the individual subcomponents that actually go into word reading and listening comprehension. This view has also been formulated as the active view of reading, which acknowledges that we have some overlapping processes between word recognition and language comprehension, and we have active self-regulation that impacts reading comprehension. Let's dig deeper into word reading versus listening comprehension, and this is setting the foundation for us to think about what are the similarities and differences between children with dyslexia and developmental language disorder. Word reading is the ability to accurately translate printed letter patterns into spoken words. When I say spoken words here, I don't just mean reading aloud, because even if you're reading silently, you're turning the letter patterns into something spoken. That's your inner voice. So you're turning it into something spoken, whether it's an inner voice or you're externalizing by reading aloud. Listening comprehension is the ability to understand spoken language. And I'll address right now that I'm probably going to use listening and language comprehension interchangeably during this presentation. And we do that based on science because we know that listening comprehension is typically measured by having children listen to short stories or passages and answer questions. Language comprehension is measured in a broader way by multiple different types of tasks. So like an example of a language comprehension task would be following multi-step directions. Another example might be to show a picture and ask, what's the name of this picture? Another example might be asking children to listen to 4 words and tell you the 2 words that go together, or to listen to a complex sentence and tell you whether it is grammatically correct. So there's multiple ways to measure listening comprehension. When we look at all those different ways, we find that it falls on a single construct of language comprehension. And so I may use these interchangeably. I'm also asked quite often about knowledge acquisition because we know children have knowledge that they need to understand text. So where does language fit? Language is the conduit to knowledge acquisition. When we think about knowledge that's required for comprehension, we're often asking children to display their knowledge through language. We ask them to tell us what they know about something, or tell us the vocabulary, or describe the meaning of concepts in knowledge. So without language, we can't convey and refine our knowledge. But without knowledge, we don't have content to convey. So these are really part and parcel, knowledge and language. Let's turn back to word reading now that I've answered some of those basic questions to clarify language comprehension. When we think of word reading, what we're wanting to measure is the ability to accurately connect letters and sounds to produce words. And we often are looking at how well children can do that fluently as well, so in a speeded task. Here's an example of a way to measure word reading that's pretty common and actually quite powerful, and that's measuring it through non-word reading. In this example, it's the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test revised, and it's the word attack subtest. I would venture to guess that even if you have never seen these words before and never administered this assessment, you can still read these non-words aloud because you know the letters and patterns of sounds and letters and how they connect in English. Children, remember, encounter new words that they're reading. And when they do, they're non-words to them as they decode them until they connect them to a meaningful representation. So hearing how children discover and attack in this word attack, how they decode new words is very helpful to determine how well they can read new words when they see them in a text. This is the old but model of reading, which just includes word reading. So these are the components of the brain that are involved in word reading. You first have activation of the visual center because you're seeing letters. And then you children quickly learn that letters are represented in a 2D space. So if if I pick up my phone right now and I turn it upside down, it's still a phone. I can turn it any which way in space and it's still a phone. But letters, you have to be careful with their orientation. It could change the label, and children learn that, and they store letters in a special area of the brain called the visual word form area, represented by red. And then if they're reading aloud or even silently, you see it turned into an auditory image for sounds. And if they're truly reading out loud, you actually activate the motor center to produce your articulators to move to make those sounds. So this is the pathway for word reading. Now let's look at the newer version of reading, which includes comprehension, because as we said, the key to reading is reading comprehension. What you see from this model is that reading is truly a full brain activity, as it involves top-down attention and serial processing. It involves access to meaning and so forth. So it is a full brain activity. Let's look at how listening comprehension is measured. Listening comprehension is typically measured by having children listen to a short passage and answer questions. So let's try that out now. I'm going to read a short passage to you from the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals 4. It's called A Lucky Bear. I'll read it to you and then ask you some comprehension questions. The big black bear walked slowly through the burned out forest, sniffing the ground. The bear's stomach growled now as he remembered eating his last meal of berries. That had been before he swam across the river and fell asleep, exhausted. Yesterday, the lightning had come out of the sky and the animals had to escape from the fire. The bear was very hungry. Suddenly, he caught the faintest smell of something familiar. Could it be acorns? The scent led the bear to a hole under a fallen tree. Okay, you listened to a short passage, and now you're going to be asked some comprehension questions. You receive a score of 1 if you get a question correct and a 0 if you don't. But what we're going to look at is how these questions, even though they're scored a 1 and 0, some of them are easier than others. So the first question, what happened to the forest? The next one, why was the bear sniffing the ground? What had the bear last eaten? What did the bear do after he swam across the river? What do you think the bear was going to do with the acorns? So you could answer those questions in your head as I gave them, but let's look at the 3 types of ways that comprehension is measured. The first one is literal interpretation questions. An example of that is, what had the bear last eaten? You might readily recall that the bear had last eaten berries. These are the easiest types of questions for children to answer. Even though you might think, well, they have to hold it in phonological memory, they're still the easier types of questions because the information is found directly in what they heard. The hardest types of questions are inference questions where they have to connect what they find in the text with their personal experience. An inference question in this passage is, what do you think the bear was going to do with the acorns? Now, you might think, based on the information in the passage, that we know acorns are food and the bear was very hungry, so he's likely to eat it. But children who struggle with comprehension difficulties will often say that the bear is going to store the acorns for the winter. Why might that be? Well, they have information about acorns. They have background information that says squirrels may collect them and store them for the winter. Now, part of inferencing is not just activating background knowledge, but it's suppressing irrelevant background knowledge, which can be very difficult for children who struggle with inferencing. The middle of the road question is the sequential information question, and this is asking things about first, next, or last, like what did the bear do after he swam across the river? That's asking you about temporal sequence and what he did. And this taps into your imagery and your sequencing ability, creating a schema for comprehension. What impacts these comprehension skills? We know that there are two primary factors, and I'm going to discuss a third one as well. The first primary factor that affects comprehension we know from research is vocabulary. Vocabulary is a very powerful predictor of comprehension. I'm going to read a passage to you that includes really vague words, so not very specific vocabulary. And children who struggle with language will often use these vague words when they can't find the exact words to represent the meaning. So these words we call general all-purpose words or gap words. And this passage has a lot of gap words. So I'm going to read this passage to you, and I want you to think about what I'm telling you and pretend you're a child in a classroom who's listening to directions from their teacher. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that's the next step. Otherwise, you're pretty well set. It's important not to overdo things. That is, it's better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. Okay, go forth and do what I told you to do. Well, that's going to be pretty difficult because there's a lot of general all-purpose vacuous words like procedure, thing, facilities, many. So you can see that there's not a lot of specific information. But if I replace some of those words with specific information, it'll make a lot more sense because this is describing how to do laundry. So if you say doing laundry is actually quite simple. First, you arrange clothes into different piles, and then you can go on, but you could also say instead of lack of facilities, if you do not have a washer and dryer. So once you give more specific information, it's still quite complex and has many steps, but will make a lot more sense. And that's because vocabulary, as I said, has a lot of impact on reading comprehension. This is just one study of many that has shown that vocabulary is impactful. Vocabulary is not only impactful on listening comprehension, but it's also impactful on word reading. These numbers represent first, second, and third graders and their data as vocabulary relates to their word recognition and listening comprehension from 0 to 1. You can see those weights are actually pretty high across the grades. It's interesting because vocabulary did not predict reading comprehension directly, but it predicted it through word recognition and listening comprehension. So it had a big impact. But this is correlational data. Here's an example of a study that brings it more to causation. In this study, we had a year-long classroom-wide language comprehension curriculum in which we implemented in a randomized control trial. And what we found is in grades 1, 2, and 3, which is approximately age 7 to 10 in the US, children who learned vocabulary words in the intervention across the year had the most gains in listening and reading comprehension. And this is in line with other work showing that as you improve vocabulary, you should see improvements in listening and reading comprehension. So vocabulary is very important, but it's not the only thing. We also know background knowledge is important. And background knowledge is the glue that holds together information. I'm going to share a passage with you in which I would argue that you're likely to know all of the vocabulary words. They're very specific, but you still will not be able to answer the comprehension questions. So listen carefully to this example. Sally first let loose a team of gophers. The plan backfired when a dog chased them away. She then threw a party, but the guests failed to bring their motorcycles. Furthermore, her stereo system was not loud enough. Obscene phone calls gave her some hope until the number was changed. It was the installation of the blinking neon lights across the street that finally did the trick. Sally framed the ad from the classified section and now has it hanging on her wall. So I would imagine that you know most of the vocabulary words, hopefully all of them. Even though this is a bit of a dated passage now, it was created in the 80s. You still know what a blinking neon light is, an obscene phone call, and motorcycles and stereo systems. So let's see if you can answer the comprehension questions. Where did Sally put the gophers? Why did Sally want the guests to bring their motorcycles? What did the ad say? Well, if you're feeling confused, it's a lot like what children with comprehension difficulties struggle with because you don't have the relevant background knowledge to answer the question. And the background knowledge I'm going to give you is the title of the passage. When I tell it to you and read the passage, you're going to cognitively feel like, oh, this is the glue holding these sentences together, and you're going to be able to answer these questions. So the background knowledge is the title. The title is Getting Rid of Bad Neighbors. Sally first let loose a team of gophers. The plan backfired when a dog chased them away. She then threw a party, but the guests failed to bring their motorcycles. Furthermore, her stereo system was not loud enough. Obscene phone calls gave her some hope until the number was changed. It was the installation of the blinking neon lights across the street that finally did the trick. Sally framed the ad from the classified section and now has it hanging on her wall. Now, I think Sally's the bad neighbor here, but this is just an example. So where did Sally want to put the gophers? Well, we know since she's trying to get rid of bad neighbors, she put them in the neighbor's yard. Why did Sally want the guests to bring their motorcycles? Motorcycles are loud and annoying, so she brought them to bother the neighbor. What did the ad say? House for sale or apartment for rent, because it was indicating that she accomplished her goal and got rid of the bad neighbors. So that gives you a sense of how you might have vocabulary, but you wouldn't have the background knowledge. And I like this quote from my neck of the woods in Boston. We hear and apprehend or comprehend only what we already half know. And you can think about passages that you've read or books or even research articles. The more you have in background knowledge, the better you are to understand those passages. But there's a third skill that is important for comprehension that I want to highlight, and that is what we call updating. Updating is where you unconsciously, for good readers, they're able to create a mental model, and then they update their mental model when they get more information. Children who struggle do not update their mental models, so they may hang on to irrelevant background information. So let's go into the example. I'm going to read a passage to you a few sentences at a time and ask you a question. John was on his way to school. He was really worried about the mathematics lesson. Okay, in this example, who is John to you? In my mind, I'm thinking he's a student, and I'm visualizing an adolescent student who's probably walking to school based on my experience, and I'm wondering why he might be nervous for the mathematics lesson. Maybe he has struggles with learning and he's very nervous about it. So in my mind, I'm activating all this information from my background knowledge about who John is. And then I'm going to read on. He thought he might not be able to control the class again today. Okay, now who's John? He's not a student. Now he's a teacher. So you then have to suppress all that information of John being an adolescent student, and you have to activate new information about John being a teacher and why he might be nervous about the class. So I'm picturing that he's a teacher who's implementing a new math curriculum. He's not really understanding how to do it, and he's a bit frustrated. So we'll read on. He thought it was unfair of the instructor to make him supervise the class for a second time. Okay, now I'm thinking he might be a student teacher or a teaching assistant or a paraeducator. So this is someone who has even less experience and he feels like he's being put on the spot and he doesn't have what he needs to do the lesson well. So that's John. And that's a long way from John being the adolescent. After all, it is not a normal part of the janitor's duties. So here we see that we were wrong about John all along. And that's part of humor, is building expectations and changing it. And children who struggle with comprehension often have difficulties with humor for that reason. But you can imagine if you held on to the background knowledge of John being a student all the way through, you would have lots of irrelevant background knowledge, and it would make the passage difficult to understand. These examples are written in an open access paper called On the Importance of Listening Comprehension, and I'm going to share these slides with you at another time. You should receive those in an email, and so you can click on the links more easily to access the information. Back to the simple view, this is the reading rope, and I highlight a YouTube chat with Dr. Hollis Scarborough, who created the reading rope, and she can tell you about it. It's about a 20-minute discussion, very informative. The reading rope includes the two components from the simple view of reading, but importantly includes some of the sub-characteristics or sub-components related to listening comprehension, like background knowledge, vocabulary, as we've discussed, and some verbal reasoning and other things. Also, word recognition includes these key components. And over time, we see that language comprehension becomes more strategic and more rich. And then you see word recognition becomes increasingly more automatic. And that's what leads to reading comprehension. So some conclusions from the simple view of reading is we have to think about both of these components if we want to think about reading comprehension. And at this point, I want to make a note on the reading wars. So in the reading wars, this has been a back and forth pendulum, but how do we teach word reading? Do we teach it by exposing children to words in authentic, rich, meaningful texts and let them discover these patterns? Or do we teach it in systematic, explicit phonics? And the simple view is very helpful in understanding this back and forth. Because we know if we teach systematic explicit phonics instruction, but we do not attend to rich language experiences that children need, then we may end up with children who do not have good reading comprehension, because it's a multiplicative relationship. If you can read words, but you don't understand the language, your reading comprehension will be poor. So we have to cover both of them. What we know is that exposing children to patterns of letters in text, authentic text, is not going to be the best way to teach them word reading. But that doesn't mean we throw out the authentic, important text and rich language that is associated with that. The reverse is the case. So if you don't teach systematic explicit phonics, children don't learn how to read words as accurately and fluently, and you focus just on language comprehension and discussion and rich text, then you still are going to have difficulties in reading comprehension. And I have a podcast that I do as a hobby, See, Hear, Speak podcast. And my first episode was with Ann Castles and Kate Nation to discuss their seminal paper from 2018 on the reading wars. I think it's really important related to reading comprehension. So let's think about how language supports reading. So what is language? Language in and of itself is quite complex, and I have this graphic as a way to marry the complexity of language with the complexity of reading comprehension, because language is developing from birth and even in utero, as experiments show that children can identify the patterns of language that they've heard in utero. So they're picking up on that even then. So children are developing language skills from birth and before, and that's setting the foundation for their future reading comprehension. How does that occur? Well, in language, we have phonology, or the form of language, and we're talking about spoken language, that's sounds. If I was talking about sign language, it would be the individual movement on my fingers and hands in space. But for spoken language, we're talking about sounds. So the form of language is sounds, and that sound representation links to letters and letter patterns to have children learn how to read words. We also have the social or pragmatic use of language, and we have the content of language through vocabulary and grammar. The use and content of language is laying the foundation for how children have good listening comprehension. And this is admittedly a too simple type of model in making these main points, because as I showed, even vocabulary influences word reading. So there's connections between all of these components of language: form, use, and content. And recently, just earlier this year, Maggie Snolling and Charles Hume, who have studied language and reading development for many decades, they have this model, the Reading is Language model, a theoretical framework for language and reading development. And I like how it showcases that pre-reading, birth to pre-K, children are developing language skills in form, use, and content. And that's setting the stage for their beginning reading, which will support their early letter sound correspondence and their early language comprehension. As they learn how to read words and text, their word reading and text includes very complex vocabulary that you often don't have in your spoken language, and also complex syntax. We see that reading text improves your language and vice versa. And those skills continue to form as they lead to age-appropriate reading comprehension. We have used the simple view of reading to subgroup poor readers because we know that all poor readers are not the same. So there are many paths to how children can have difficulty in reading comprehension, and the simple view helps us to determine those paths, and it also gives us some guidance on how we need to support struggling readers. So we first published this about over 20 years ago now, and it's often referred to as the quadrant model, where we look at children who have poor reading comprehension. And then we dig deeper and we examine their word recognition or their single word accuracy, and sometimes it's timed and untimed. And then we look at their listening comprehension ability, which is their ability to understand text. I'm sorry, not understand text, understand spoken language. And actually, as you're sitting here listening to this webinar, you're engaging in listening comprehension. So the first group we found is children who have poor word recognition. So they have difficulty reading words, but if you read those words aloud to them in language comprehension assessments, they can do quite well. And this is the classic characterization of dyslexia. Dyslexia is at the heart a word reading difficulty. And I'm going to share some facts about dyslexia. And I want you to hold those in your memory as we turn our attention to the opposite side of the quadrant. Some facts about dyslexia. Dyslexia is a neurodiversity. It represents a brain difference that makes it difficult for some children to connect letters and sounds to read words accurately and fluently. It tends to run in families, which indicates a genetic basis, and it occurs quite frequently in 1 in 10 children. Here in the US and all over the world, there has been policies set in place to screen and support children with dyslexia, including teacher education and more. On the opposite side of the quadrant, we found children who had good word reading, but poor listening comprehension. These children were accurate and fluent at reading single words, but when you read a passage aloud to them, they did not understand the language that they heard. These children have the opposite difficulty of those who have dyslexia, and we found that these two quadrants, even though they have opposite problems, can have the same poor reading comprehension struggles. So these children have been referred to as poor comprehenders. They've also been referred to as children with specific comprehension deficit. I didn't really like poor comprehender because, as I said, children with dyslexia also have poor reading comprehension, but for a different reason. Specific comprehension got us a little closer, but what I like and have started using in the past 8 years or so is the label of developmental language disorder. And that's tying together the work on a very common language impairment that children can have that you can detect before they learn to read and before they engage in reading comprehension. But we often see this pattern for them where they have good reading and they have poor listening comprehension. I will just give you a preview that there were many children who had poor word recognition and poor listening comprehension in that lower quadrant, and that the overlap between developmental language disorder and dyslexia is approximately 50 to 80%. So it's not 100%, but there is a higher overlap between these two neurodiversities. So developmental language disorder, let's dig into that and see how it's the same or different from dyslexia. Developmental language disorder is when a child or adult has difficulty talking or understanding language. Here are some facts about developmental language disorder, or DLD. It is a neurodiversity, which represents a brain difference that's part of the human condition that makes it difficult to learn new words and remember them for vocabulary, and learn grammar and remember it. It tends to run in families, which indicates it has a genetic basis. It occurs in approximately 1 in 10 children, and there is a 50 to 80% overlap with dyslexia. But unlike dyslexia, the public awareness of DLD is quite low, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. So what you can see is that there's quite a bit of overlap between DLD and dyslexia. They're both neurodiversities, which is a human brain difference. They do tend to run in families, so they have a genetic basis, and they have a similar prevalence in 1 in 10 children. But the key difference between these two is that in one case, for dyslexia, the difficulty is reading words, connecting letters, and letter sound patterns. Whereas for dyslexia or DLD, the hallmark is difficulty with new words and remembering them. Now we're going to turn to a video because I can talk to you a lot about DLD, but the best way to learn is to hear a video to share lived experiences of people who have DLD, including children and adults and parents who support them. So bear with me as I transition to the video. Make sure I share my sound. Okay, this is sharing my sound for this video, and you should be able to hear it now, and I'll make the screen large and I'll put on the closed captions for you.
Hi, I'm Eddie. And I'm Dils. We're here to tell about DLD, Developmental Language Disorder. Let's go, hurry up. Come on, we don't have all day. Today we're going to find out about DLD and explain 3 things what you have to know. DLD 1, 2, 3. We're going to interview some people, but we can't find them anywhere. Ah, found you! Have you heard of DLD? Developmental Language Disorder. It's when you have difficulty talking and understanding words. Who has DLD? It affects children and adults. Has it always been called DLD? It's been called lots of things like SLI, but now it's been agreed being called DLD. What's DLD like? It's just like they're speaking different language. You're not even like oblivious of what they're saying to you. You just want them to speak English, not those big words, because it's just making it way more harder. You really want to say something and it just stops. Your brain is just gone, is that the word? No, it's not. Is it this one? No, it's not. It's picking out loads of different things. I just want it to teleport to the other person's head so they know what it means and they get what I'm trying to say to them as quickly as I can. So there you are, Dils. DLD is when children or adults have problems with talking or understanding. Well, that's really interesting, Eddie. I'm going to try and find out some more. Why do we need to know about DLD?
It's very important that we know about DLD because it's very common, but it's very hidden. And a lot of people don't realize that. It affects about 2 children in every classroom, which is really surprising.
So why does it matter?
It is important because it affects reading, writing, learning, joining in with things, and of course self-esteem. We weren't aware our child had DLD because it was hidden. Even though it's common, it's hidden, and we weren't understanding that he had difficulties at school with his learning, his understanding, which all affected his self-esteem.
So there you go, Eddie. It's really common and it's hidden. It can make lots of things hard, like school and reading. It can be hard joining in and feeling good about yourself. I see, Dylan. Let's see if there's any help. What help is out there?
There's all sorts of help. I was helped by speech language therapists, teachers and other professionals. My parents helped me. In fact, all sorts of people can help you. Your colleagues and your friends too.
How can they help?
It really makes a difference if people can understand about DLD. It's hard for me to explain what DLD means, but when people do understand, it makes a big difference.
So, Dylan, there is help. And everybody can help by knowing about DLD. So remember, DLD 1, 2, 3. Please share our film. Thank you for watching.
Okay, I hope you found that helpful. I think a video is worth so much in hearing personal experiences. And I like that video. It's one of the first ones that was created to bring true awareness for DLD. I'm going to share another one now, which gives a lived experience from Grant, who shared with our DLD and Me team his experience, and I think it's quite powerful. So let's watch the next video.
So I was trying to like think of a way of describing it. It's kind of like you know, like tip of the tongue where you know the word but it just does not come to you. It's kind of like that, very like all the time. I was a very quiet kid, so I remember I talked. So I tried to talk like my father. He also, I say, speaks funny, but maybe that's just because now I'm hindsight 2020 and play some. But I think there was, like I would say, I don't know. I have. Sorry, I'm just trying to form my words. Like I think it was definitely there. It's just no one around me really paid attention. Makes sense. So, especially in a small town, there's not really a lot of resources for these disorders, basically. There's no SLP or anything like that. So, yeah, I do think it was there. I just think it wasn't really explored. The classic example is like kids will grow out of it, like they'll mature out of it, which clearly is not true. When it first came into like, I became aware of it was probably in high school. I put in assignments and everything would be correct. Like they would say, this is a perfect essay, whatever. But I would lose marks all the time for my grammar errors. So I'd have to like call my mom and be like, hey, what's this? Like I know the word, but I don't know the word. I have had the university has or I've been accused of academic dishonesty because of my writing. The professor had assumed that because like when you read my writing, it looks very there's very little morphemes. So he thought a Chinese student had written my essay. Say I'm making a resume, I have to get someone to check it, or like I'll give you the example of I didn't include the I on my last name, and no one could contact me for those months. Stuff like that. Just like it's so minute and so not necessary, but it happens. So, but that's nothing that I can't deal with, of course. So. Stuff like that. It's just these little things that you don't really think of until you have to think about them. Like if I'm at a coffee shop, like I kind of try. I will plan before I say anything so that I know exactly. Like I go in with a plan, or else I will flubber around and it'll just get embarrassing. So I do it, and I do this quite, even with making friends, I have like scripts that I will go through. My questions aren't novel. They're actually just a mirror of what the person is saying too. So with a little twist to make it individualized. Not everyone knows I have DLD. And if I say like, hey, or like, oh yeah, I'm doing DLD, I have text me too. I have to explain every single time what DLD is. And so now I just say learning disorder because, or language disorder, because it's much quicker and people get touched on quicker. So there's like ways I've tried to solve around it, but yeah, I think a community is not necessarily developed yet. So hopefully this will help.
Well, I hope that made a lot of sense for you. And I think listening to the personal experience is very important to learn more. So now I'll continue on. I want you to think about, what you learned from those videos. And there's more on our DLD and Me website if you want to learn more from others, including parents who can share their experience. Now I'll restart the PowerPoint. Okay, so why isn't DLD better known? What's going on if we know that this occurs in approximately 1 in 10 children, but it is less known than dyslexia? And I think it's because it's been called by many names, and this was hinted to in the DLD 123 video. So children with DLD have been referred to by many different labels according to silos in our field. So in terms of research, these children have been referred to primarily as children with specific language impairment, but also language learning impairment and DLD. Clinically speaking, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, these children are referred to as children with language disorder or specific learning disorder in comprehension. Billing here in the US, so for our insurance companies, we'll see that it's referred to as expressive language disorder, expressive and receptive language disorder. And also in terms of qualification, especially here in the US, but all over, it is referred to as a developmental delay, a speech and language impairment, or a communication disorder, or a specific learning disability and comprehension. So this was recognized as a major impairment to or impediment to getting the word out and advocacy for DLD by Dorothy Bishop and many others. And so she put together a large group of international researchers and clinicians, and they went through the Delphi consensus process, and they determined that we should use one label across the world, and that label is DLD. So why does it matter with labels? So I'll tell you about a story that I often hear in the US, and it was heard so often that we looked at our national data to see what's going on. And this is really the best case scenario here. So a parent may have a child who has difficulty with language, and they are a late talker. So they're just not producing language. And a late talker by definition is a child who has less than 50 words at age 2 and no 2-word combinations. So they may go to their
Tiffany,
doctor.
can I just interrupt for a minute? I'm not sure if you're wanting to share a screen, but we can just see you. We can't see. I can only see you.
I think that's just you, Carla.
Okay,
I can see your screen. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to double check. Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay,
Sorry.
great.
Sorry for interrupting.
No problem, Carla. I'm glad you checked because I really want to make sure. So in this story, these children have difficulty. They're late talkers. And so they are told that they have a developmental delay. And they may receive some support services, parent training on how to, stimulate language and such. But then they're often dismissed from those services around age 3. And that's because that's when the services are released. And then they go on and they may go on to a preschool program, and then they're told that we have some concerns. And then they get evaluated, likely by a speech language pathologist, and they're told that they have a speech and language impairment or a communication disorder. And then what happens is they go on to school, their formal schooling. They may go a couple years, especially if they're good word readers, and they seem to be doing well. And then they hit a real slump, and they're not doing well around 10 or 11 years old. And then they're told, we're worried your child has a specific learning disability. So where does DLD fit? Well, DLD is the underlying diagnosis, and these are the labels that have been used to qualify children for support services. And that's really, really tricky for parents and the community if they don't have a label to rally around. So I want to chat for a minute about what language development looks like in these children. Language development, as characterized by Mabel Rice, who's a researcher who has studied these children for many decades, she says that the language development is like the train leaving the station late. So they develop language, but it starts late. So they're often late talkers. That's a very common characteristic for these children. But what we know is that their developmental sequence is similar to typically developing peers. It's just persistently delayed. What does DLD look like in the classroom? Well, unfortunately, it can be mischaracterized as personality traits like shy. They're also often referred to as being hesitant. We see that they drop sentences, and you saw that in the video of Grant. So they may start one direction, make a different direction, have difficulty recalling words. They have unclear stories. So they may be telling stories, and storytelling is a common human function, but it's unclear what happens first, next, last, who's the main character. The sequence is tricky. They often look to peers for answers, so complex directions are very difficult. So they may get the first step and then look around to see what everyone else is doing. Unfortunately, they can be mislabeled as uncooperative, mischievous, emotional, or unintelligent. Unfortunately, one of the biggest myths is that they're unintelligent, and that's because intelligence is measured by verbal intelligence and nonverbal intelligence. They are going to have difficulty in verbal intelligence because that's their area of weakness. And unfortunately, language is often used as a metric for intelligence, but we know they have a wide range of nonverbal intelligence and other intelligence like emotional intelligence. Because language is what we're swimming in our schools, it's how we're communicating, it's how we're teaching new skills. They have overall academic difficulties in reading, math, and just social studies, science, and all of the areas. Now, it is common in 1 in 10 children, but it's often hidden, and that's because we see that only about 20% of children with DLD are identified. There's often some misidentification as well. Just in the US alone, that means that we have over 1 million kindergartners that are struggling with language. And DLD has been found in every language that has been studied all over the world. So this is a problem of identification and support across the world. What we know is that children who are supported are often those who have other difficulties because DLD has high co-occurrence with ADHD, dyslexia, speech sound disorder. So they have a high co-occurrence. So maybe they have one difficulty and they get a comprehensive evaluation and they discover DLD. But oftentimes they have a parent who has high socioeconomic status. So we have a parent who has the income and the education to fight for support services or give them support services. And this is really unacceptable, but luckily advocacy is starting to pay off with the DLD and Me team. We've been advocating across multiple platforms. So now the DSM-5 has DLD in it. The ICD-11 codes for insurance billing purposes also has DLD in it. I've been working with our federal government here so DLD can qualify for a category. And we have some states that have put into law that DLD must be screened for in the school systems along with dyslexia. I've just been trying to get the word out with lots of different multimedias. I want to draw attention to the resource of DLD and Me, which is focused on English summaries of research and short digestible bits. And we also have a lot of resources like infographic and parent letters and parent resources. Rattle is another organization raising awareness of DLD. DLD has been found in every language studied because it's part of the human condition. And so we have fact sheets translated in over 20 languages. In Australia, there's the DLD Project, which is an international effort to bring awareness to DLD and create a community and support research for DLD. I've been working with a resource called Reading Rockets and Reading Universe, where we're focusing on developmental language disorder as another neurodiversity along with dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and such. There's lots of resources that I've been creating with others, but really focusing on the educational outcomes for children with DLD. So these are some more resources for you. So October is ADHD Awareness Month, it's Dyslexia Awareness Month, and we also have DLD Awareness Day in October. It was on October 17th, and monuments were lit up all over the world including in Australia and over there. And also we had Niagara Falls, which is in Canada, lit up in purple and yellow. And again, lots of monuments in the color of DLD awareness. So back to the simple view, we have children who have difficulty in word reading that can be characterized by dyslexia, children with difficulty in listening comprehension characterized by DLD, and importantly, there's many children, about 50 to 80%, that have an overlap. So if you're working with children with dyslexia, you are likely working with children with DLD and vice versa. But this quadrant model makes it look like it's very clean and easy, but I wanted to show you some raw data where all these circles represent children, and you can see that there's severity. So you have a range of abilities in word reading, a range of ability in listening comprehension, and we have to mark where we count as having this difficulty, but it truly is on a continuum. So we have to support both word reading and language comprehension for all children. If we take it back to language, we know that dyslexia has difficulty in more the phonological aspect of connecting letters and sounds. Developmental language disorder has the difficulty in content. So both dyslexia and DLD are language learning disabilities, but they're different types. I've written about this in an open access paper that I'm linked into the slides, and also linked a video of me explaining more thoroughly the quadrant model. So what are some of the implications in our last few minutes? We need to assess both word reading and language ability when a child is struggling in academics. And oftentimes these evaluations are done in silos, so you don't always have a comprehensive evaluation, and it's very important to do so you can determine. Ideally, we want to see early identification of both of these difficulties, because we know that early identification gives you the biggest boost, but it's never too late to identify DLD and provide support. In terms of early identification, one of the hardest things is that we want to identify reading comprehension problems, but children can't read. But we have this longitudinal data, in which we follow children before they enter school in pre-kindergarten, and we follow them through grade 3 in this example study. This is the structural equation model, but this is how we've written it up for the International Dyslexia Association, that shows that if you have deficits in preschool, oral language, in vocabulary, grammar, inferencing, that is an indication that you are very likely to have difficulty later on, which will affect your reading comprehension, and the same can be said for word reading. So these skills are separable skills. They do overlap, but they're separable, and they both need to be stimulated, and we have to have early identification for both. And what I see is a lot of focus on dyslexia, which is fantastic, and early word reading. But if we don't focus on both sides of the simple view, we are not going to see improvements in reading comprehension. And we know that a lot of children who are identified late as poor readers, so they read words well and then they struggle later on, it's not that they are late emerging poor readers, they are actually late identified, because when we measure language early on and throughout the school year, we can find that these children who struggle later on and have that lower quadrant of developmental language disorder with good word reading, we can identify their poor word reading early on, or their poor language early on. So the goals we have with school partners is we want to routinely screen and progress monitor for word reading and for language comprehension, so we can provide support for both. We want evidence-based instruction, systematic and explicit, in both word reading and language comprehension that's developmentally appropriate across the grades. And ideally, we want to build an understanding of neurodiversity in the whole child to focus on both strengths and weaknesses. We formalize this in relation to the multi-tiered systems of support, which is screening, progress monitoring, just what I said, but putting it visually. And this is occurring in schools for word reading, but we want to see it occur for language comprehension as well, so that we would have two approaches. So we're identifying and supporting both word reading and language comprehension, and ideally we could support them together. We have many findings, but you are truly the key, because I'm the person in the middle saying A equals B, but you're going out to your classrooms and saying, we've got some problems. And these red lines represent the barriers to getting evidence into practice. So it is very, very tricky, but you are truly the key. I'm going to just tell you that I'm linking lots of resources for you around language screening, diagnostics around DLD, how to support children with DLD in the classroom. And I want you to keep in mind that the relationship is key. It really only takes one educator to really see a child with DLD to make a huge difference in their lives. So these resources are out there for you. We do in the final minutes have some challenges, but I also see them as opportunities. We need to continue to refine the way that we identify dyslexia and DLD to make sure that it's appropriate. We need to ensure that if we're labeling children as having dyslexia or DLD, that label is actually helpful for them and not harmful. We need to advocate for children with DLD, even though we're still trying to figure out the best way to support them. And we truly need to work together with those who have DLD to learn from their lived experiences and also work with educators to create practices that stick in the school. Thank you so much for your time. I do want to thank you deeply because you are truly changing the world one child at a time by what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for sharing all your wisdom with us and helping just broaden our understanding of DLD as a whole. It's really encouraging to see that I guess more awareness is out there. And I know here in New Zealand, it does seem like every year when we get to October, more and more people are aware of dyslexia, DLD, and other neurodiversity that's out there. So we really appreciate you taking the time to help us learn more so that we can be advocates for the children in front of us every day.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you want to connect with Tiffany, she had her details up on her previous slide. And at Learning Matters, we will get an email out to you with a recording as well as a PDF of some of Tiffany's slides that she's so graciously agreed to share out with you guys. If you do have any questions going forward, please feel free again to contact Tiffany, or you can send through questions to Carla. Her email is carla@learningmatters.co.nz. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.